The Straits Times, on the 11th of January 1911, reported the following news from the local magistrate's court. Quote, "The full charge was that, on or about June 9th, within the settlement of Singapore, dangerous petroleum was loaded under deck on the steam vessel Karang, a vessel which was not constructed for the carriage of petroleum in bulk, and which had not the confining bulkhead of the cargo holds constructed for iron or steel."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Dangerous Cargo of the Karang?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Karang was considered a very old vessel by 1911. She had started her life in Greenock in 1875, and the 334-ton iron-hulled packet steamship had gone through many owners before she had been purchased in 1910 by the Labuan Steamship Company Limited. She was in fact the only ship listed under the company's name in Lloyd's Register of Shipping at the time. The Singapore-based steamship company itself had only been formed in 1910, and it made sense that they were starting small. They had reportedly done some heavy maintenance on the aging ship after they had acquired her, so there was an attempt to take care of their investment. On June 7, 1911, Captain Coleman, acting deputy master, attendant, had a visit in his office from Mr. Held, who was the director of the Labuan Steamship Company. Mr. Held had come to directly ask Captain Coleman if he could load petroleum into the Karang. They had a consignment load of petroleum products owned by the East Asiatic Company, coming from Pulau Sambo, that they were then supposed to transport to Bangkok. Captain Coleman responded that he had no jurisdiction over the loading of petroleum so long as the rules of the port were followed, and he told Mr. Held to load his flammable cargo outside of the harbor limits. Captain Coleman suggested that Mr. Held get a copy of the ordinance on loading petroleum and read it to ensure all the regulations were followed. On the morning of June 10th, Captain Coleman received a letter from the Labuan Steamship Company to inform him that they were going to load the petroleum on their ship. That same afternoon, Captain Coleman received the information in his office that the Karang was on fire. The Karang had followed the harbor rules, and they anchored outside the harbor limits before they began to load their flammable cargo. They would begin the task of transferring the cargo from the lighter on the 9th, but the job would continue into the morning of the 10th under the supervision of Captain Mellor and the officers under him. They did exercise caution, ensuring that any leaking canisters were rejected and returned to the lighter rather than brought on board the ship. There was one important detail that Mr. Held had failed to tell Captain Coleman when asking if they were right to accept the cargo, and it was a fact which would have changed everything. Captain Coleman had been told that the cargo was petroleum products, which was technically accurate, but what the cargo consisted of was 2,000 cases of benzene. Benzene, with its significantly low flash point, was considered legally to be of the category dangerous petroleum, rather than simply petroleum. Loading dangerous petroleum did require a certification from the master attendant of the harbor, which they had not acquired, and also had requirements for ships that the Karang did not meet. They should have had waterproof bulkheads made of iron or steel in which to house the dangerous petroleum that the elderly packet steamship did not have. No one on the ship seemed to recognize the danger, however, and by 11 a.m. on the 10th, the benzene was all stowed below decks on the Karang. Having completed the loading of his ship, Captain Mellor went on shore to get port clearance sorted out and arrange for some stores to be delivered to his ship. He would therefore be absent when disaster would strike, around 1:30 in the afternoon. The highest-ranking officer on the ship at the time was Chief Officer Beatty, though it is hard to tell how much he knew about the ship at that point, since he had only signed onto the ship at 8 a.m., and a little over 5 hours later smoke was issuing from her hold. He did not react badly all the same. He immediately sent word to the Master Attendant's office, as well as to the Tanjong Pagar Dock Board's fire brigade. The response on shore was equally prompt. Commander Radcliffe and Captain Chalmers, who was acting senior boarding officer, headed to the blazing ship with the launches, the Vedette and Lady Evelyn. By 2, the government-owned steam salvage tug, the Varuna, had also arrived. They were lucky that she was in the port, since she was often away doing salvage work, but she had very powerful pumps on board that were employed when she was in port for firefighting efforts. The owners of the Karang and Captain Coleman had by now also been able to reach the scene of the fire, accompanied by the officers of the fire brigade with the Tanjong Pagar fire float. The ship, the Sea Mew, was also in port, and her captain, Captain Murphy, accompanied by his officers and engineers, also came to join the fight against the fire. By the time the full force of the firefighting effort had arrived, however, it was no longer a matter of some smoke. The flames were bursting from the forehold of the Karang at a great height. Captain Davies of the Varuna and Mr. Pett of the fire brigade decided to focus the bulk of the water towards the forehold only to have the afterhold catch fire. Faced with the possibility of a new explosion of the highly flammable cargo, the focus of the water was turned to the aft hatch. The flames at the aft of the ship soon reached the main mast, but they were able to extinguish this portion of the fire before the mast was entirely burned through. With this done, they turned their attention back to the forehold area, where the fire seemed to have started. A hindrance to putting out the fire in the forward part of the Karang was the awnings that stretched over the ship, which made it hard for the Varuna to aim the hose into the heart of the fire. The men from the Seamew, as well as the officers and members of the fire brigade, decided that something had to be done about the awnings, and in an act of incredible bravery, in the face of still exploding benzene canisters, they climbed on board the burning ship and cut off the awnings. It was a tense moment for those people who had gathered to watch the fight against the fire from other vessels and on shore. But their mission was successful, and they were able to reach their boat again, while the hoses of the Varuna were now able to pour water with full force into the hold of the Karang. It was agreed that it would be better to tow the Karang to more shallow water so that, if she did sink, she would do so where she could be salvaged, but there was no chain or gear on the tugs to tow the burning ship. In any case, the captain of the Tanjong Pagar fire float, which was the suggested ship to take on the task, felt that such a task was likely to be too dangerous for himself and his crew if they did attempt it. With the high flames licking around the Karang, it was too easy for the fire to catch hold of his vessel as well. The fight against the fire on the Karang remained where it had started, and no attempt to tow was made. For those on land, about 3/4 of a mile away, by 5 p.m., it seemed as though the fire was almost entirely put out, and there was only the occasional lick of fire or smoke. The onlookers were therefore shocked when the fire hit a previously untouched pocket of fuel, and the fire suddenly burst for the forward part of the ship again. The Karang had already been looking low in the water, and with the fire regaining intensity, it proved too much for the aging vessel. The middle and fore part of the ship were burned through completely, despite the continuous water that was poured onto her. And at 6:15, she sank in 6 fathoms of water, with only the top of the funnel showing above the water. The loss of the ship did not mean that the work of the Varuna was over. The ship had to remain on scene until 7 to put out all of the flaming wreckage that was still afloat before it caught anything else on fire. Once that was complete, all they could do was mark the site of the sunken steamer with a red lantern and return to shore with the reassurance that at least everyone had survived the experience. Now, all that remained was the cleanup and to go figure out what happened. It never would be found out what had caused the benzene to catch fire in the first place, and the focus instead was directed on what it was doing in such an unsuitable vessel to start with. Captain Mellor was quick to admit to Captain Coleman that he did not have a certificate to load dangerous petroleum. On June 12th, Mr. Held was once again in the master attendant's office, this time with a letter for Captain Coleman from his company. In it stated that there had been a misunderstanding that had led to the omission of the word dangerous in front of the word petroleum in their previous letter to him. Mr. Held asked Captain Coleman if it was too late to get a certificate for their cargo, which it clearly was since the cargo as well as the ship were now a navigational hazard only a short way away from the harbor. Soon after the owners of the Labuan Steamship Company, as well as Captain Mellor, were forced to stand before the senior magistrate's court and answer for why they had violated the 1908 Petroleum Act, to which the answer was simply ignorance of the rules and regulations. Their ignorance would cost them dearly. The insurance company, after some legal fighting, did finally settle with the owners to pay out for the Karang, but she was a total loss and not worth salvaging in her condition. The owners of the Karang would not only find themselves out of a ship, however. They also were found liable by the courts for the $2,600 it had cost to destroy the wreck so that it was no longer a navigational hazard. The task was undertaken by the Royal Engineers under the direction of Captain Coleman, as they laid charges of gelignite and used it to break up the hull of the ship. The Royal Engineers had watched as tins of benzene had drifted to the surface, and the petroleum that had not burned soon discolored the water around the wreckage. On the 24th of August, shortly after the tins of benzene had drifted on the tide from the demolition of the Karang, there would be one last reminder of the Karang's dangerous cargo. Sergeant James of the Marine Police received a report that a sampan boat was on fire in the harbor, and he took another sampan to investigate. On reaching the burning boat, he found that it had been abandoned, but on board it was a large number of tins of benzene, which had been presumably among those released by the explosion. The boat was burning strongly, and nearby were a couple more tins of benzene which had not been collected yet. Sergeant James decided that, as a precaution, he would take them on board his boat, only to have the first one that he brought on board catch into flames almost as soon as it was in the sampan. Sergeant James was forced to throw the burning tin back into the sea to put out the fire, in the process burning his arm. Still concerned about others picking up the remaining tin and suffering a similar fate, he brought the last tin that had been floating near the burning boat onto his boat. Once he reached land, he had it brought by rickshaw with him to the Marine Police Station, where he had it placed on the ground in front of the station instead of brought inside. Sergeant James tossed some money for the fare to the rickshaw puller, but the man failed to catch it, and it dropped to the ground. It was late at night by now, and without thinking about it, the rickshaw puller lit a match to try to find where the money had fallen. The rickshaw immediately caught on fire in an incredible blaze. It was found that the tin that Sergeant James had pulled from the water had developed a leak, and it had gotten in the rickshaw. Fortunately, the rickshaw puller was only slightly burned from the experience, but his rickshaw was entirely destroyed, and Sergeant James was forced to go to the hospital due to the severity of his injuries, though he was reported to have returned to duty quickly. The entire incident would cause a discussion about a lack of powerful firefighting tools in the harbor and how much better other harbors were equipped compared to the harbor of Singapore. It was pointed out that the officials were reluctant to even send out the Varuna unless they were certain that they would receive payment for doing so. This would be compounded when the Dutch steamer, the Ophir, with a cargo of kerosene, caught fire while inside the harbor in November of the same year. This time, the ship would be saved, though badly damaged, but there would be an even greater cry for a dedicated fire float designed to fight petroleum fires to be added to the harbor for the good of all the shipping that traveled in and out and could also be put in danger. The traffic in petroleum products was increasing, and it had to be admitted that the fire measures had not changed to reflect the changes in cargo that were traveling through.
For more information, please see the Straits budget from the 31st of August, 1911, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.